The distant thunder of hooves against sun-baked earth was the only warning Harriet Ross had before the dust cloud appeared on the horizon. Her fingers tightened around the worn shotgun as she squinted into the late afternoon sun, her heart pounding against her ribs. 3 riders, maybe 4. Coming straight for the small homestead she'd fought so desperately to keep since her father's passing just 6 months ago. Texas, 1875. The land was as unforgiving as the men who sought to claim it. Harriet tucked a loose strand of auburn hair behind her ear and straightened her spine. At 22, she wasn't about to be chased from her home in Dalhart, Texas, not after everything she'd sacrificed to hold on to it. The farm wasn't much, but it was hers, and in a world where women were expected to marry or move on, Harriet had chosen a third option: survive. The riders drew closer. Harriet recognized the lead man instantly, his expensive suit and polished boots unmistakable even at a distance. Edwin Chambers, the banker who'd been pressuring her to sell since the day they'd lowered her father's coffin into the ground. But the tall figure riding beside him, a stranger on a midnight black stallion, caught her attention. Unlike Chambers and his men, who rode with the stiff posture of men unused to long journeys, this man moved as one with his horse. His face was shadowed beneath a wide-brimmed hat, but something about his relaxed posture suggested danger coiled like a rattlesnake, ready to strike. "Miss Ross," Chambers called out, his voice carrying across the yard as the men pulled their horses to a stop. "Lovely as always to see you maintaining this charming property." Harriet didn't lower her shotgun. "State your business, Mr. Chambers. I've got chores waiting." Chambers smiled, though it didn't reach his eyes. "I've brought an associate today. Someone I thought might help you understand your situation." He gestured to the tall stranger. "This is Mr. Wade Quinn. He's recently arrived from Colorado and has expressed interest in this region." The stranger Quinn tipped his hat slightly, revealing piercing blue eyes that assessed her with unsettling thoroughness. "Madam," he said simply, his voice deep and rough, like stones rolling down a dry creek bed. "Mr. Quinn is considering investing in several properties," Chambers continued, "including this one. He's quite persuasive when it comes to reluctant sellers." The threat wasn't subtle. Harriet's grip tightened on her shotgun. "This land isn't for sale. Not to you, not to your friend, not to anyone." Chambers sighed dramatically. "Miss Ross, you're a woman alone. Surely you understand the dangers. Why, just last week the Miller place was burned to the ground. Terrible tragedy." "Are you threatening me, Mr. Chambers?" "Threatening? My dear, I'm concerned for your welfare." His smile turned cold. "Accidents happen all the time out here." The stranger Quinn shifted in his saddle, drawing Harriet's attention. For the briefest moment, something like displeasure crossed his face before his expression returned to careful neutrality. "You have 1 week to reconsider," Chambers said, turning his horse. "After that, I can't guarantee what might happen." He nodded to his men and they began to ride away, all except Quinn, who remained motionless on his horse, those blue eyes still studying her. "Your employer is leaving, Mr. Quinn," Harriet said sharply. "He's not my employer," Quinn replied evenly. "Just someone who hired me for a job. Burning women out of their homes must pay well." Something dangerous flashed in his eyes. "I don't burn homes, Miss Ross, especially not those with women inside them." "Then what exactly did he hire you for?" Quinn adjusted his hat against the setting sun. "To persuade you." He glanced toward the retreating figures of Chambers and his men, then back to Harriet, though he wasn't entirely forthcoming about the situation. "The situation is simple," Harriet replied, finally lowering her shotgun slightly. "That man wants my land and I won't sell. There's nothing more to discuss." Quinn studied her homestead, the small but sturdy cabin, the modest barn, the struggling vegetable garden before returning his gaze to her face. "There's always more to discuss, Miss Ross." He paused. "Especially when Chambers has hired the Blackwood brothers to visit you tomorrow night." Harriet felt the blood drain from her face. The Blackwood brothers were notorious throughout the territory robbers and killers who'd burned out more than one stubborn homesteader. "Why are you telling me this?" Quinn's mouth tightened into a grim line. "Because I don't work with men who threaten women, and I don't abide by those who hire others to do their dirty work rather than face consequences themselves." "Why should I believe you?" "You shouldn't," he shrugged. "But I'll be back at sunset tomorrow. If you're smart, you'll be ready to leave. I'm not abandoning my home." Quinn leaned forward slightly in his saddle. "Then I suggest you prepare to defend it, Miss Ross, because those men won't be coming to talk." With that, he turned his horse and rode after Chambers, leaving Harriet standing in her yard, shotgun hanging loosely in her hands, watching as the dust cloud swallowed him whole. The night passed slowly, with Harriet checking and rechecking the shotgun, and the small revolver her father had taught her to use. Sleep came in fitful bursts, with every creak of the cabin's wooden frame jolting her awake. By morning, dark circles shadowed her eyes, and her nerves felt frayed as old rope. She spent the day reinforcing the cabin as best she could, moving furniture to block windows, gathering extra water and ammunition. Part of her wondered if the stranger Quinn had been lying, trying to frighten her into leaving before Chambers returned with another offer. But something in his eyes had rung true, and Harriet had survived this long by trusting her instincts. The sun was beginning its descent when she heard the approach of a single rider. Moving quickly to the window, she saw the now familiar silhouette of Wade Quinn on his black stallion, riding alone toward her cabin. Harriet met him on the porch, shotgun ready. "You're still here," Quinn observed, dismounting smoothly. Up close, she could see the faint lines around his eyes, the small scar that cut through his right eyebrow, the way his gaze constantly swept their surroundings. A man accustomed to trouble. "This is my home," she said simply. He nodded as if he'd expected nothing less. "The Blackwoods will be here after dark, 3 of them, all armed." He removed his saddlebags from his horse. "May I come in?" "Why, so you can tell me more about the men coming to burn me out." Quinn's expression hardened. "So I can help you survive the night." Harriet stared at him, searching his face for any sign of deception. "Why would you help me? You work for Chambers." "Worked," he corrected. "Past tense. Our association ended when I discovered what he really wanted." He met her gaze directly. "I don't kill women or burn homes, Miss Ross, not for any price." "Then what do you do, Mr. Quinn?" "Whatever pays," he answered honestly. "But even a gun for hire has lines he won't cross." Harriet considered him for a long moment, weighing her limited options. She couldn't fight 3 armed men alone. If Quinn was telling the truth, she needed his help. If he was lying, she was in trouble either way. "One night," she finally said. "You can stay until morning, then you ride out and I never see you again." Something like amusement flickered across his face. "One night of protection, that's all I'm offering." She stepped aside to let him enter. "That's all I'll accept." Inside the cabin, Quinn moved with the careful precision of a man assessing a battlefield. He examined her preparations with a professional eye, occasionally nodding in approval or subtly rearranging her defenses. "Your father teach you to shoot?" he asked, checking the revolver she'd placed on the table. "Yes," said a woman alone needs to protect herself. "Smart man." Quinn handed the gun back. "You're a good shot." "Good enough." He almost smiled at that. "We'll hope so." He glanced out the window at the fading light. "They'll come from the north through those trees. Best approach if you're trying to avoid being seen." Harriet followed his gaze. "How can you be sure?" Because it's what I do." He moved away from the window. And men like the Blackwoods are predictable. They rely on fear more than skill. As darkness fell, Quinn positioned himself near the front window, rifle ready. Harriet took the back, her shotgun loaded and waiting. The silence between them was tense but not uncomfortable, the quiet of two people focused on survival. "Why this place?" Quinn asked suddenly. "Chambers seems desperate for it. There must be a reason." Harriet hesitated before answering. "My father believed there's water beneath this land." "A lot of it. He was digging a well when he died." Quinn nodded slowly. "Water rights. In this country, that's more valuable than gold. Chambers thinks so. He's been buying up all the struggling farms in the area." She met his eyes across the darkened room. "If he controls the water, he controls everything. And you're the last holdout." "I am." Something like respect crossed Quinn's face. "Brave, possibly foolish, but brave." Before Harriet could respond, Quinn held up a hand for silence. In the distance, she could hear the soft approach of horses, not on the main trail, but coming through the trees exactly as he'd predicted. "Get down," Quinn whispered, moving smoothly to extinguish the lamp. The cabin plunged into darkness, broken only by the faint moonlight filtering through the windows. Harriet crouched behind a heavy oak table, shotgun ready, heart hammering against her ribs. "When they come," Quinn said quietly, "aim low. Most men expect shots at chest height." The horses stopped at the edge of the property. Through the window, Harriet could see three shadowy figures dismounting, their movements suggesting confidence, the easy motions of men who expected little resistance. "Remember," Quinn murmured, "one night of protection. That's my promise." Their eyes met briefly in the darkness. "One night," she agreed. The Blackwoods approached with the casual swagger of men accustomed to instilling fear. The largest of them carried a torch, its flame casting long shadows across the yard. "Come out, Miss Ross," called a gravelly voice. "Mr. Chambers sends his regards, says it's time for you to move on." Harriet remained silent, watching as the men spread out around the cabin. "We can do this easy," the man continued, "or we can do it hard, but either way you won't be sleeping here tonight." Quinn caught her eye and shook his head slightly, warning her to remain silent. He'd shifted position, moving like a shadow to a better vantage point. The men conferred briefly before the one with the torch approached the porch. "Last chance, lady. Come out now, or we burn it down with you inside." The moment the first man set foot on the porch steps, Quinn fired. The shot was deafeningly loud in the confined space, and the man fell backward with a startled cry, clutching his leg. "Next one won't be in the leg," Quinn called out, his voice carrying easily in the night air. "Take your wounded and go." Cursing erupted from the yard, followed by the sharp retort of gunfire. Bullets splintered the wood around the windows as the Blackwoods returned fire. "Stay down," Quinn ordered, moving to another position as shots continued to pepper the cabin. Harriet kept her head low, but her eyes tracked the movement outside. One of the men was circling toward the back of the cabin her side. She adjusted her grip on the shotgun, waiting. The moment a shadow passed her window, she fired. The shotgun's blast was tremendous, and she heard a scream followed by the sound of a body hitting the ground. Quinn gave her an approving glance before returning his attention to the front. The fighting continued in violent bursts, moments of intense gunfire followed by tense silence. Through it all, Quinn moved with the fluid grace of a man who'd done this many times before, anticipating their attackers' moves, conserving ammunition, creating the impression of more defenders than just the two of them. Eventually, after what seemed like hours but was probably only 20 minutes, a voice called from the darkness. "Quinn, that you in there?" "It is," Quinn replied calmly. Chambers didn't say nothing about facing Wade Quinn. There was grudging respect in the voice. "Said it was just a woman alone." He lied. "Now take your brothers and go, Blackwood. This place isn't worth dying for." A long pause followed. "This ain't over." "It is for tonight," Quinn answered. Harriet heard the sounds of the men retreating, one clearly wounded badly, another supporting him. Soon, the muffled thunder of hoofbeats confirmed their departure. Only then did Quinn lower his rifle, though his posture remained alert. They might circle back. "We'll need to keep watch through the night." Harriet nodded, suddenly aware of the tremble in her hands, the acrid smell of gunpowder filling the cabin, the splinters of wood covering the floor. "You're bleeding," Quinn said, nodding toward her arm. Harriet glanced down, surprised to see a tear in her sleeve darkened with blood. Just a graze. But now that she'd noticed it, the wound began to sting fiercely. Quinn crossed to her, his movements still cautious. "Let me see." His hands were surprisingly gentle as he examined the wound, his calloused fingers contrasting with the careful way he rolled back her sleeve. "Not deep," he confirmed, "but it needs cleaning." He glanced up, meeting her eyes. "You've got supplies." Harriet nodded toward a cabinet. "Bandages and whiskey in there." Quinn retrieved them, then knelt beside her chair. As he cleaned the wound, Harriet studied him, the lines of concentration between his brows, the steady hands that had so efficiently wielded a weapon now tending carefully to her injury. "You've done this before," she observed, "too many times." He wrapped a clean bandage around her arm. "Though usually on myself." "How did you know?" she asked. "About the Blackwoods, about Chambers." Quinn secured the bandage before answering. "I make it my business to know who I'm working for." "And who I'm working against." His eyes met hers. "Chambers has a reputation. Should have checked more thoroughly before taking his money." "Why did you take his money, I mean?" He shrugged. "Same reason anyone does anything out here, needed to eat." He stood, moving back to the window to check the darkness beyond. "Get some rest if you can. I'll take first watch." Harriet didn't move. "Thank you for the warning, for staying." Quinn glanced back at her, his expression unreadable in the dim light. One night of protection, that was the deal. Still, not many would have switched sides. "I didn't switch sides, Miss Ross. I just realized I was on the wrong one to begin with." As promised, Quinn kept watch while Harriet rested, though sleep proved elusive. Every sound from outside, the wind in the trees, an owl's distant call, the occasional creak of the cabin settling brought her instantly alert. Near midnight, she gave up pretending and joined Quinn by the window. "You should be sleeping," he said, not looking away from his vigilant survey of the property. "Can't." She settled beside him, maintaining a careful distance. "Too many thoughts." Quinn acknowledged this with a slight nod. They sat in companionable silence for a while, both watching the moonlit yard, the shadows of trees, the distant horizon. "They'll come back," Harriet said finally. "If not the Blackwoods, then others. Chambers won't stop." "No," Quinn agreed. "He won't. I can't keep fighting them off." "Not alone." Quinn turned to study her face. "You're considering selling?" "Never." The vehemence in her voice surprised even her. "This was my father's dream, his future, mine too. Dreams cost, Miss Ross, sometimes more than we can afford to pay. Some things are worth any price, Mr. Quinn." Something shifted in his expression, a softening around the eyes, a slight relaxation of his perpetual vigilance. "Yes," he agreed quietly. "Some things are." The night stretched on, with Quinn and Harriet taking turns watching while the other rested. By dawn, no further trouble had materialized, but neither lowered their guard as sunlight gradually illuminated the property. Quinn checked outside thoroughly before declaring it safe enough for Harriet to step onto the porch. In the harsh morning light, the evidence of the previous night's attack was starkly visible: bullet holes in the cabin walls, Bloodstains on the dirt where Harriet's shotgun blast had found its mark, trampled vegetation where the Blackwoods had approached. "They'll need time to regroup," Quinn said, surveying the scene. "The one you hit won't be riding anytime soon, if ever." Harriet felt a twist of something, not quite regret, but a somber acknowledgement of what had been necessary. "What happens now?" Quinn turned to face her. "Now I ride out as agreed. One night of protection." He paused, studying her face. "And you decide what your next move will be. I already told you, I'm not selling. Then you need a different strategy. Chambers won't stop sending men, and eventually you'll run out of luck or ammunition." Harriet crossed her arms, wincing slightly at the pull on her injured arm. "What would you suggest, Mr. Quinn?" He considered her question seriously. "Information is power out here, Miss Ross. Find something Chambers doesn't want known. Everyone has secrets, especially men who build their empires on the backs of others. And how would I do that? He's not likely to confide in me." The ghost of a smile touched Quinn's lips. "No, but men like Chambers keep records, and they trust their power will protect them from consequences." Harriet absorbed this, turning the idea over in her mind. "You think I should look for evidence of wrongdoing?" "I think you need leverage," Quinn corrected. "Something that makes attacking you more costly than leaving you alone." He moved toward his horse, which had been safely secured in her small barn overnight. As he saddled the animal, Harriet followed, feeling strangely reluctant to see him leave. "Where will you go?" she asked. Quinn tightened the saddle cinch before answering. "Away from Dalhart. Chambers won't take kindly to my change of allegiance. You could stay." The words escaped before Harriet could consider them. "I mean, there's work here. Repairs after the attack. The well my father started." Quinn paused, his hands stilling on the saddle. For a brief moment, something vulnerable passed across his face, a longing quickly suppressed. "One night," he reminded her softly. "That was our agreement. Agreements can change, circumstances do." He turned to face her fully. "What are you asking, Miss Ross?" Harriet took a deep breath. "I'm asking for help. I'll pay what I can. It won't be much, but it's not about money." "Then what is it about?" Quinn looked away, his gaze traveling over the small homestead, the distant horizon, before returning to her face. "People like me don't stay in one place, Miss Ross. We're not built for it. Or maybe you've never found a reason to." The words hung between them, charged with meaning neither was ready to acknowledge. Finally, Quinn mounted his horse, looking down at her from the saddle. "Secure your property," he said, "and be careful in town. Chambers has eyes everywhere." Harriet nodded, stepping back as he turned his horse toward the trail. She watched him ride a few paces before calling out, "Mr. Quinn?" He pulled his mount to a halt, looking back over his shoulder. "Thank you," she said simply, "for keeping your promise." Something unreadable crossed his face before he nodded once and continued riding, disappearing into the morning sun, leaving Harriet standing alone beside her bullet-riddled cabin. The next few days passed in a blur of repairs and heightened vigilance. Harriet slept little, jumping at every sound, her shotgun never far from reach. She replayed Quinn's advice in her mind repeatedly, considering how to find leverage against a man as powerful as Chambers. On the fourth day after the attack, necessity forced her into town for supplies. Dalhart was a small settlement, one main street lined with essential businesses, a couple of saloons, a small church, and the imposing brick building that housed Chambers Bank. Harriet felt eyes on her the moment she drove her wagon into town. Conversations paused as she passed, only to resume in hushed whispers once she was beyond earshot. News traveled fast in places like Dalhart. Everyone knew about the shootout at the Ross homestead, though the versions she overheard varied wildly in their details. At the general store, Old Mr. Peterson watched her warily as she gathered her supplies. "Heard you had some trouble out at your place," he said finally, tallying her purchases. "Nothing I couldn't handle," Harriet replied evenly. Peterson's eyes flicked briefly toward the bank across the street. "Chambers was in here yesterday, asking questions about you," he lowered his voice, "and about Quinn." Harriet's heart skipped. What kind of questions? Wanted to know if anyone had seen him, offered money for information. Peterson carefully wrapped her purchases in brown paper. "Said Quinn stole from him." "That's not true. Didn't figure it was." Peterson handed her the parcels. "But be careful, Miss Ross. Chambers is telling anyone who'll listen that you're harboring a thief and a murderer." Harriet thanked him for the warning and headed back to her wagon. As she loaded her supplies, she felt the weight of stares from passers-by. Her status in town had always been precarious. A woman alone was viewed with suspicion or pity, but now there was something else in their gazes: fear, judgment. She was securing the last of her purchases when a shadow fell across the wagon. Looking up, she found herself face to face with Edwin Chambers himself, flanked by the town sheriff. "Miss Ross," Chambers said, his smile not reaching his cold eyes. "How fortunate to find you in town. I've been concerned about your welfare after that unfortunate incident at your property." Harriet straightened, keeping her expression neutral. "Your concern is unnecessary, Mr. Chambers, and unexpected, given that you sent those men to burn me out." The sheriff shifted uncomfortably, but Chambers merely widened his smile. "A serious accusation, Miss Ross, and entirely unfounded. I understand from the Blackwood boys that it was Wade Quinn who instigated the violence." He turned slightly toward the sheriff. "A known criminal I unwisely hired, not realizing his violent tendencies." "That's not what happened," Harriet said firmly. "Quinn warned me about your plot. He helped defend my home against men you hired to destroy it." Chambers made a show of looking concerned. "I fear Quinn has manipulated you, Miss Ross. He's a dangerous man with a history of deception." He placed a hand on the sheriff's shoulder. "Sheriff Miller here has received reports of Quinn's misdeeds across 3 territories." The sheriff nodded. "There are wanted posters, Miss Ross, for robbery and murder in Colorado." Harriet felt a cold weight settle in her stomach. Quinn had admitted to being a hired gun, but murder? She pushed the doubt away. "If you're looking for criminals, Mr. Chambers, perhaps start with the men who attacked my home." "The Blackwoods claim they were merely passing by when Quinn opened fire from your property," the sheriff said. "One of them may lose his leg." "That's a lie," Harriet insisted. "They came with torches, threatening to burn me out." Chambers sighed dramatically. "It's your word against theirs, I'm afraid, and with Quinn's involvement." He let the implication hang in the air. "Sheriff Miller is investigating the matter thoroughly, of course." The sheriff at least had the decency to look uncomfortable. "Just doing my job, Miss Ross." "Your job," Harriet repeated coolly, "or whatever Chambers pays you to do," the sheriff flushed. "That's uncalled for." "Is it?" Harriet held his gaze until he looked away. Chambers' smile tightened. "I came to make you a final offer, Miss Ross. In light of recent events, I'm prepared to be generous. $500 for your property, more than fair given its condition. Not interested. I strongly suggest you reconsider. The frontier is no place for a woman alone." Chambers leaned closer, dropping his voice. "Especially one who consorts with known criminals." "Is that a threat, Mr. Chambers?" "A reality, Miss Ross. Quinn won't be coming back to save you again. Men like that never do." He straightened his expensive jacket. "My offer stands until the end of the week. After that—" He shrugged eloquently. As Chambers and the sheriff walked away, Harriet gripped the edge of her wagon, fighting to maintain her composure. The entire exchange had been witnessed by half the town. exactly as Chambers had intended. He was isolating her, making her vulnerable by turning public opinion against her. And what of Quinn? Were the accusations true? He'd admitted to working as a hired gun, but had never mentioned wanted posters or murder charges. The seed of doubt Chambers had planted took root, despite her efforts to dismiss it. Lost in these troubling thoughts, Harriet almost missed the slight figure approaching her wagon. It was Lena Johnson, the young woman who worked at the town's small telegraph office. "Miss Ross," Lena said quietly, glancing around to ensure no one was watching them, "I have something for you." She pressed a folded piece of paper into Harriet's hand. "It came yesterday." "A telegram?" Harriet asked, confused. Lena shook her head. "Not exactly. A man paid me to deliver it to you when you came to town, said it was important." "What man?" Lena bit her lip. "Tall, blue eyes, didn't give his name, but—" She hesitated. "I heard the talk about what happened at your place, about Quinn." Harriet's pulse quickened. "Thank you, Lena." The young woman nodded and hurried back toward the telegraph office, casting nervous glances over her shoulder. Harriet waited until she was alone before unfolding the paper. Inside was a hastily scrawled note. "Chambers keeps his records in a safe behind the painting in his office. Combination 1836-7. What you need is in the red ledger. Be careful." Her heart raced as she read the words again. Quinn had left town, but apparently not before gathering critical information and finding a way to get it to her. The note was both a lifeline and a confirmation that his advice about finding leverage had been sincere. It was also dangerously close to suggesting she break into the bank. Harriet carefully tucked the note into her pocket, her mind working furiously. The bank would be nearly empty during the town's upcoming Founders' Day celebration in 2 days. Chambers always gave a speech in the town square, meaning his office would be unoccupied. She pushed the thought away, shocked at herself for even considering it. But as she climbed onto her wagon and set out for home, the idea refused to fade. What choice did she have? Chambers was systematically destroying her reputation while preparing for another attack on her property. Without leverage, without help, she would eventually lose everything. The sun was setting by the time Harriet reached her homestead. As she unhitched her horse, she noticed fresh hoofprints in the dirt near her barn, prints that hadn't been there when she left that morning. Someone had visited while she was gone. Moving cautiously, shotgun ready, Harriet approached the barn. The door was slightly ajar, though she distinctly remembered securing it before leaving. Heart pounding, she pushed it open, weapon raised. "I'd appreciate if you didn't shoot me, Miss Ross. Once was enough." The familiar voice came from the shadows at the back of the barn. Wade Quinn stepped forward, his hands slightly raised in a gesture of peace. "Quinn," she breathed, lowering the shotgun. "What are you doing here?" He looked different than when he'd left, more trail-worn, with several days' worth of beard shadowing his jaw. But his eyes were the same, that piercing blue that seemed to see more than she wanted to reveal. "Came to warn you," he said, moving closer. "Chambers is planning something. Something bigger than sending a few hired guns your way. I know. I saw him in town today." She studied Quinn's face carefully. "He says you're wanted for murder in Colorado." Quinn didn't flinch at the accusation. "I've done things I'm not proud of, Miss Ross. But I've never murdered anyone who wasn't trying to kill me first." "That's not a denial." "No," he agreed. "It's not." They regarded each other in the fading light, the air between them heavy with unspoken questions. Finally, Harriet made a decision. She reached into her pocket and withdrew his note. "You left this for me." Quinn nodded. "Information, like I suggested. It's more than a suggestion. It's practically a blueprint for breaking into Chambers' bank." "Is it?" A faint smile touched his lips. "I merely noted where he keeps his records. and how to access them. Knowledge is a tool, Miss Ross. How you use it is your choice. Harriet folded the note carefully, considering her next words. Why did you come back? Really? Something vulnerable flickered across Quinn's face. I told myself it was to warn you, that it was the honorable thing to do. But, he held her gaze steadily, but I think we both know that's not the whole truth. The admission hung between them, neither willing to be the first to acknowledge what it might mean. Finally, Harriet broke the silence. You should come inside, it's getting dark. Quinn hesitated, then nodded. Just for tonight, I'll be gone by morning. Another one-night promise, Mr. Quinn. His eyes softened at her words. Seems that way, Miss Ross. Inside the cabin, Harriet busied herself preparing a simple meal while Quinn examined the repairs she'd made since the attack. His fingers traced a patched bullet hole in the wall, his expression thoughtful. You've been busy, he observed. Didn't have much choice. She set plates on the table. Sit, eat. They dined in companionable silence, the tension from their earlier conversation gradually easing. As Harriet cleared the plates, Quinn finally spoke again. What will you do? About Chambers? She leaned against the counter, considering her answer. What would you do? Something you shouldn't have to. His voice was quiet but intense. This isn't your fight, Miss Ross. It became my fight when Chambers decided he wanted my land. She crossed her arms. And I'm not giving up my home. Quinn studied her, a mixture of admiration and concern in his gaze. The information in that ledger, if it exists, if you can get to it, it could be dangerous. Men like Chambers don't take kindly to having their secrets exposed. So I should just surrender. Let him win. I'm saying be careful. He stood, moving closer to her. Chambers has connections, influence. He can make your life difficult in ways that go beyond hired thugs. He already is. Harriet met his eyes directly. The whole town thinks I'm harboring a criminal, that I can't be trusted. Quinn winced slightly. I'm sorry for that. My presence has complicated things for you. Your presence saved my life, she corrected. Then, more softly, and I'm not sorry for it. Something shifted in Quinn's expression, a softening, a vulnerability he rarely allowed himself to show. He stepped closer, close enough that Harriet could feel the warmth radiating from him, could see the faint scar along his jawline she hadn't noticed before. Harriet, he said, using her given name for the first time. The sound of it in his deep voice sent an unexpected shiver through her. I came back because I couldn't stop thinking about you, about this place. He gestured to the small cabin around them, about what it might be like to stay. The admission hung between them, weighted with possibilities neither had dared consider before. Harriet's heart hammered against her ribs as she looked up at him, suddenly aware of how close they were standing. Then stay, she whispered. Quinn's eyes darkened. Slowly, giving her every chance to pull away, he raised his hand to cup her cheek. His touch was gentle, calloused fingers warm against her skin. You don't know what you're asking, he murmured. What I've done, who I am. I know enough. Harriet leaned into his touch. I know you kept your promise when you could have ridden away. I know you came back when you didn't have to. Something broke in Quinn's careful control. With a soft sound that might have been surrender, he lowered his head and kissed her. The first touch of his lips against hers was gentle, questioning. But when Harriet's arms came up to encircle his neck, the kiss deepened, becoming something hungrier, more desperate. Quinn's arms wrapped around her waist, drawing her against him as if he couldn't bear any distance between them. Harriet had been kissed before awkward, fumbling encounters with local boys that had left her wondering what all the fuss was about. But this was different. This was a storm breaking after too long a drought, overwhelming in its intensity, yet somehow exactly what she needed. When they finally broke apart, both breathless, Quinn rested his forehead against hers. "That wasn't part of our agreement," he said ruefully. Harriet smiled, her fingers still tangled in his hair. "I'm willing to renegotiate terms." He laughed softly, the sound warming her more than it should have. But then his expression grew serious again. "Harriet, I meant what I said. You don't know the things I've done." "Then tell me," she challenged. "No more secrets, no more half-truths. If you want to stay, if this is going to be something, then I need to know who Wade Quinn really is." Quinn stepped back slightly, though he kept hold of her hands. "It's not a pretty story. Few worth telling are." He led her to the small sofa near the fireplace, and they sat facing each other, their knees touching. Quinn stared into the flames for a long moment before beginning. "I was born in Missouri to a farmer and his wife. Simple people, good people. Had a younger sister, too." His voice took on a distant quality. "When I was 14, raiders came through during the war. Bushwhackers, they called themselves. They burned everything, killed my father when he tried to stop them." He swallowed hard. "My mother and sister didn't survive what came after." Harriet squeezed his hand but remained silent, letting him continue at his own pace. "I ran. Survived however I could. Learned to shoot because I had to. Learned to fight because the alternative was dying." His eyes met hers. "By the time I was 20, I'd become what I needed to be to survive. Hired gun, bounty hunter, whatever paid, but I had rules. Lines I wouldn't cross. The wanted posters in Colorado," Quinn nodded. "There was a mining baron there. Ruthless man who'd caused the deaths of dozens of workers through negligence. When their families sought compensation, he hired men to silence them permanently." His jaw tightened at the memory. "I was contracted by a group of widows to deliver justice. The law wouldn't touch him, he owned the local judge, so they pooled everything they had and hired me. You killed him. I intended to bring him in to a federal marshal in the next territory. Evidence, witnesses, everything needed for a proper trial." Quinn's expression darkened. "But he drew on me first. I defended myself. His death was ruled self-defense by the federal authorities, but the local sheriff who was on his payroll issued those wanted posters." Harriet processed this information, turning it over in her mind. "And that's why you're so cautious about Chambers. You've seen what men like him are capable of." "Yes." Quinn met her eyes directly. "Men with money and power believe they're untouchable, and usually they're right." "But not always," Harriet said softly. "Not if someone stands against them." Quinn's thumb traced circles on the back of her hand. "It's a dangerous path, Harriet. So is surrendering to a bully." She leaned forward slightly. "I believe you, Wade, about who you are, about what happened, and I'm not afraid of your past." Something vulnerable and hopeful flickered in his eyes. "Maybe you should be." Instead of answering, Harriet closed the distance between them and kissed him again. This time there was no hesitation, only the certainty of two people finding something unexpected but necessary in each other. When they parted, Quinn's eyes remained closed for a moment, as if savoring the feeling. "This changes things," he said finally. "I hope so," Harriet replied. That night they talked for hours, sharing stories of their pasts, their hopes, the paths that had led them to this moment. Quinn spoke of his years drifting from job to job, place to place, never staying long enough to form connections. Harriet told him about her father's dreams for the farm, about the years she'd spent helping him build something from nothing, only to watch him die before seeing it come to fruition. As the fire burned low, their conversation turned again to Chambers and his determination to acquire Harriet's land. "The Founders' Day celebration is the day after tomorrow," Harriet said. "Everyone in town will be in the square for Chambers' speech." Quinn studied her face in the firelight. "You're thinking about the bank." "I'm thinking about survival," she corrected. About fighting back the only way I can." He was quiet for a long moment. "It's risky if you're caught." "I won't be." She met his gaze steadily. "Not if you help me." Quinn's expression shifted through a range of emotions: concern, reluctance, and finally, resolution. "If we do this, we do it my way, carefully, with a plan for every possibility." Harriet felt a surge of relief mixed with nervous anticipation. His hand found hers in the dim light. "We." The next day was spent in careful preparation. Quinn rode into the neighboring town to avoid being seen in Dalhart, returning with detailed information about the bank's layout, the guard schedules, and confirmation about the Founders' Day celebrations. "Chambers always gives his speech at noon," Quinn reported as they sat at Harriet's kitchen table, mapping out their plan. "It lasts at least 30 minutes, followed by the ribbon cutting for the new schoolhouse he funded. That gives us a window." Harriet nodded, committing the details to memory. "And the bank. One guard remains during the celebration. He's stationed at the front door but makes rounds every 15 minutes." Quinn sketched a rough diagram of the bank's interior. "Chambers' office is here at the back. The painting is of a mountain landscape, hideous thing but expensive looking." "How do we get past the guard?" Quinn's expression turned grim. "We don't. I create a distraction outside that draws him away from his post. You slip in through the rear entrance, get what you need, and get out. 5 minutes, no more." The plan was simple but dependent on precise timing and, Harriet had to admit, a considerable amount of luck. If anything went wrong, if she was discovered, if the safe combination didn't work, if the ledger wasn't there, the consequences would be severe. "What if the ledger doesn't contain anything useful?" she asked, voicing her greatest fear. Quinn considered this. "Chambers is too careful, too controlling to not keep records. Men like him believe in their own invulnerability. They document everything because they never expect anyone to see it." "And if I'm caught?" His eyes met hers, serious and intense. "You won't be. But if something goes wrong, I'll be there. I won't let anything happen to you." The conviction in his voice shouldn't have been as reassuring as it was, given the enormity of what they were planning. But Harriet found herself believing him, trusting him in a way she'd never trusted anyone outside her family. As evening fell, they finalized the details of their plan, going over each step, each contingency, until both were satisfied. Finally, exhausted but resolved, they sat together on the porch, watching as stars appeared one by one in the darkening sky. "This time tomorrow it will be done," Harriet said softly. "One way or another." Quinn's arm slipped around her shoulders, drawing her against his side. "Are you afraid?" "Yes," she admitted, "but not enough to stop." He pressed a kiss to her temple. "Your father would be proud of you, standing your ground like this." "I think he would have liked you," Harriet said, surprising herself with the realization. "He valued honesty and courage above all else." Quinn was quiet for a moment. "Even with my past, especially with your past." She turned to face him. "You could have continued as you were, taking jobs without questioning, looking the other way when it suited you. Instead, you chose to help me, at considerable risk to yourself." "That takes courage," he smiled, though it didn't quite reach his eyes, "or foolishness. Sometimes they're the same thing." Harriet leaned her head against his shoulder. "What will you do after tomorrow?" The question hung between them, weighted with possibilities. Quinn's arm tightened slightly around her. "That depends," he said finally. "On what?" His voice was low, almost hesitant. "On whether there's a reason for me to stay." Harriet's heart beat faster at his words. "I can think of at least one." Quinn turned toward her, his expression more open, more vulnerable than she'd ever seen it. "Harriet Ross, are you asking a notorious gunslinger to court you properly?" Despite the seriousness of their situation, she found herself smiling. "I believe I am, Mr. Quinn, if you're amenable." Instead of answering with words, Quinn cupped her face in his hands and kissed her a kiss that held promise, hope, and a future neither had dared imagine before. When they finally parted, he rested his forehead against hers. "I should warn you, I don't know the first thing about farming." Harriet laughed softly. "Fortunately, I do. You can learn." The night passed too quickly, with both of them too keyed up to sleep much. By dawn they were ready, their plan memorized, their roles clear. Quinn would ride into town first, establishing himself at the saloon opposite the bank where he could watch the comings and goings. Harriet would arrive later, ostensibly to witness the Founders' Day celebrations like any other citizen. As they prepared to part ways, Quinn pulled Harriet close, his expression serious. "If anything feels wrong, anything at all, you walk away. Understand, the ledger isn't worth your safety." Harriet nodded, touched by his concern. "I'll be careful." And Harriet, his voice softened. "No matter what happens today, know that meeting you." He paused, searching for words. "It changed everything for me." Before she could respond, he kissed her once more, then mounted his horse and rode toward town, leaving Harriet with a heart full of conflicting emotions: fear, determination, and something dangerously close to love. Dalhart was transformed when Harriet arrived later that morning. Bunting and flags decorated the main street, and people from outlying homesteads had gathered for the celebration. Children ran between market stalls set up for the occasion, while adults gathered in groups, talking and laughing. No one paid much attention to Harriet as she made her way through the crowd, though she noticed a few sideways glances and hushed conversations as she passed. Chambers' campaign to discredit her was clearly working, but today that worked in her favor. People were avoiding her rather than engaging, making it easier to move unnoticed. From her position near the town square, she could see the bank across the street. The guard was visible through the front window, looking bored as he watched the festivities from his post. Of Quinn, there was no sign, though she knew he was watching from the saloon as planned. At precisely 15 minutes before noon, a loud commotion erupted from the direction of the livery stable. People turned to look as several horses broke free, galloping down the main street and causing momentary chaos. As expected, the bank guard stepped outside to see what was happening. This was her signal. Heart pounding, Harriet slipped away from the crowd and moved quickly toward the back of the bank. The rear entrance was unlocked, just as Quinn had promised it would be. Taking a deep breath, she stepped inside. The bank's back rooms were deserted, everyone having gone to watch Chambers' speech. Harriet moved swiftly through the corridor toward his office, her footsteps muffled by the plush carpet. The door was locked, but Quinn had anticipated this too. The small tool he'd given her made quick work of the simple mechanism. Inside, Chambers' office was exactly as Quinn had described it. Opulently furnished with heavy wooden furniture, leather-bound books lining one wall, and directly behind the desk, a large painting of a mountain landscape. Just as he'd said, hideous but expensive-looking. Harriet moved to the painting and carefully lifted it from the wall, revealing the safe behind it. Her fingers trembled slightly as she turned the dial. 18 right, 36 left, 7 right. The mechanism clicked, and when she turned the handle, the safe door swung open. Inside were stacks of papers, several bags that clinked with the sound of coins, and 3 ledgers: black, brown, and red. Harriet reached for the red one, her heart racing as she opened it. The pages were filled with Chambers' neat handwriting records of transactions, names, dates, amounts. At first glance, it looked like ordinary bank business, but as Harriet scanned the entries more carefully, she realized what she was seeing. Chambers had been systematically cheating his depositors, charging hidden fees, manipulating mortgage terms, and in several cases, falsifying documents to seize properties when owners fell behind on payments they didn't actually owe. More damning still were the records of bribes paid to the sheriff, the county judge, and several territorial officials. Chambers had been buying influence and protection for years, all meticulously documented in his own hand. This was the leverage she needed. Harriet quickly copied several of the most incriminating entries onto the paper she'd brought, then carefully returned the ledger to its place. She was about to close the safe when something else caught her eye, a document with her father's name on it. With shaking hands, she pulled it out and scanned the contents. It was a geological survey of her property, dated 2 years earlier while her father was still alive. The report confirmed what her father had always believed. There was a substantial underground water source beneath their land, one that could support irrigation for hundreds of acres. But attached to the survey was a letter to Chambers from a mining company, expressing interest in purchasing water rights for a planned operation nearby. The sum mentioned made Harriet's breath catch $50,000, a fortune by any standard. Chambers had known all along why her father's land was valuable. He'd been trying to acquire it cheaply, planning to sell the water rights for an enormous profit, and her father had never known. Harriet copied this information as well, then returned everything to the safe, closed it, and replaced the painting. She was about to leave when she heard footsteps in the corridor outside. Her heart froze. It was too early, the guard shouldn't be back yet, and Chambers was supposed to be giving his speech. Moving as quietly as possible, Harriet slipped behind a heavy curtain that covered one of the office windows, praying whoever it was wouldn't enter. The door opened. Through a small gap in the curtain, Harriet could see Chambers himself entering, accompanied by a well-dressed stranger. "We can speak privately here," Chambers was saying. "The celebration will continue for at least another hour." "I appreciate the discretion," the stranger replied. "My investors are eager to move forward with the mining operation, but the water situation remains problematic." Harriet held her breath as Chambers moved to sit behind his desk, directly in her line of sight. "As I've assured you, Mr. Harrington, that problem is nearly resolved. The Ross property will be mine within the week." Chambers smiled coldly. "The girl is isolated, discredited. Even if she somehow resists selling, I've arranged for more permanent solutions." The stranger, Harrington, looked uncomfortable. "I was under the impression you were making a legitimate purchase. And you'll have legitimate water rights, I assure you. The method of acquisition need not concern your investors." Chambers leaned forward. $50,000 is the agreed price. "Once you deliver clear title to the water rights, yes." Harriet remained motionless behind the curtain, scarcely daring to breathe as the men continued their discussion. After what seemed like an eternity, they finally stood to leave. "I'll see you at the celebration," Chambers said. "We can continue our discussion at dinner tonight." Once the door closed behind them, Harriet waited several agonizing minutes before emerging from her hiding place. Her legs felt weak, but she forced herself to move quickly, slipping out of the office and back down the corridor toward the rear exit. She was nearly there when the bank's front door opened, and the guard returned to his post. Freezing in place, Harriet pressed herself against the wall, out of his direct line of sight but dangerously exposed if he turned around. For a moment, she thought she'd been caught, then a commotion erupted from the street outside. The guard moved to the front window, giving Harriet the opportunity she needed to slip out the back door and away from the bank. Her heart pounded as she made her way through the back alleys, eventually emerging near the edge of the crowd gathered for the celebrations. Chambers was on a platform in the town square, concluding his speech to enthusiastic applause. The sight of him made Harriet's blood boil, knowing now the full extent of his corruption. She scanned the crowd for Quinn, finally spotting him near the saloon, his posture tense as he searched for her. When their eyes met, the relief on his face was palpable. He gave a slight nod toward the edge of town, their predetermined meeting place. Harriet made her way there gradually, careful not to draw attention. When she finally reached the stand of trees where Quinn waited with their horses, her composure nearly broke. "You're late," he said, the worry in his voice belying his casual tone. "I was about to come looking for you. Chambers came back early, with a mining investor." Harriet's words tumbled out. "I had to hide, but Wade, I found it, everything we needed and more." Quinn pulled her into his arms, holding her tightly. "You're safe, that's what matters." As they rode back to Harriet's homestead, she told him everything, the evidence of Chambers' fraud, the bribes, and most importantly, the truth about the water rights and the mining company's interest. $50,000, Quinn said, shaking his head in disbelief. "No wonder he was so determined. My father died never knowing what he'd discovered." Harriet's voice caught. "He always believed in that well, and Chambers let him think he was chasing a dream while planning to steal it all along." Back at the cabin, they spread out the papers Harriet had copied, examining each piece of evidence carefully. "This is more than enough," Quinn said finally. "The territorial marshal in El Paso would be very interested in these records of bribes. And the depositors Chambers has been cheating would tear him apart if they knew." "So what do we do?" Harriet asked. "Take this to the marshal." Quinn considered this. "Chambers would know immediately who was responsible. He'd retaliate before any official action could be taken." He tapped the papers thoughtfully. "No, we need to approach this differently. Use the information as leverage, just as we planned." They spent the evening crafting a careful strategy. By dawn, they had their plan, a plan that depended not on official justice, which could be corrupted or delayed, but on Chambers' own fear of exposure and public humiliation. "It's risky," Quinn warned. "Cornered men are dangerous, and Chambers has a lot to lose." "So do I," Harriet replied. "But I'm done being afraid of him." The next morning, they rode into Dalhart together. Quinn no longer made any attempt to conceal his presence, and the townsfolk stared openly as they made their way to the bank. Inside, the teller blanched at the sight of them. "We need to see Mr. Chambers," Harriet said clearly, her voice carrying through the quiet bank. "Immediately." He's in a meeting," the teller stammered. "I can't interrupt." "Yes, you can," Quinn said, his hand resting casually near his holstered pistol. "Tell him Harriet Ross is here about the water rights to her property. And the red ledger." At the mention of the ledger, the teller's eyes widened. Without further protest, he hurried to Chambers' office. Minutes later, they were ushered inside, where Chambers sat behind his desk, his face a careful mask of polite inquiry. If he was surprised or alarmed by their visit, he hid it well. "Miss Ross, Mr. Quinn, this is unexpected." His gaze flicked to Quinn. "Especially given the outstanding warrants for your arrest, sir," Quinn smiled thinly. "Funny thing about warrants. They require evidence to be enforced, much like accusations of fraud and bribery." Chambers stiffened almost imperceptibly. "I'm not sure what you're implying." Harriet stepped forward, placing a sealed envelope on his desk. "We're not implying anything, Mr. Chambers. We're stating facts, facts that are documented in your own handwriting." "In the red ledger," Quinn added, watching as Chambers' face paled slightly. "The one you keep in your safe." Chambers' eyes darted to the painting behind him, then back to his visitors. "You broke into my safe." His voice was controlled, but an edge of panic had crept in. "That's a serious crime, Miss Ross." "Not as serious as systematically defrauding your depositors," Harriet replied calmly. or bribing officials, or conspiring to steal property through threats and violence. Allegations without proof, Chambers sneered. Though his confidence seemed to be slipping, Quinn leaned forward. That envelope contains copies of select entries from your ledger. Enough to ruin you if they became public. His voice hardened. The originals are in a secure location, to be delivered to the territorial marshal and every newspaper within 100 miles if anything happens to Miss Ross or her property. Chambers stared at the envelope for a long moment. What do you want? First, a legally binding agreement recognizing my full ownership of my land and all water rights associated with it, Harriet said. Drafted by a lawyer of my choosing, not yours. Second, Quinn continued, you will cease all efforts to acquire property through intimidation or manipulation of mortgage terms. Those whose land you've already stolen through such means will receive fair compensation. That's absurd, Chambers sputtered. You can't prove. Page 36 of your ledger details exactly how you falsified Joseph Miller's mortgage documents, Harriet interrupted. And on page 42, you documented bribing Judge Wilson to rule in your favor when Miller contested the foreclosure. Chambers' face had gone ashen. You've made your point, but what you're asking would bankrupt me. Not with the $50,000 you're about to receive from the mining company, Quinn said. A fair portion of which rightfully belongs to Miss Ross, given that it's her water they're paying for. A tense silence filled the office as Chambers visibly calculated his options. Finally, his shoulders slumped in defeat. How do I know you won't expose me anyway once you have what you want? You don't, Harriet said honestly. But unlike you, Mr. Chambers, I keep my word. Agree to our terms, make restitution to those you've wronged, and your ledger remains private. And if I refuse, Quinn smiled, though there was no warmth in it. Then, by this time tomorrow, every person in this territory will know exactly how Edwin Chambers built his empire. I imagine they won't take kindly to discovering their hard-earned money has been lining your pockets instead of earning interest in their accounts. Another long silence followed. Finally, Chambers reached for a piece of paper. I'll draft the agreement now. No, Harriet said firmly. As I mentioned, it will be drafted by my lawyer with terms I approve. She stood. We'll return tomorrow morning. Have your answer ready. As they turned to leave, Chambers called after them, his voice tight with suppressed rage. This isn't over, Miss Ross. Quinn paused, looking back over his shoulder. For your sake, Mr. Chambers, I hope it is. Outside the bank, Harriet released a shuddering breath she hadn't realized she'd been holding. Quinn's hand found hers, squeezing gently. You were magnificent, he said softly. I was terrified, she admitted. The two aren't mutually exclusive. He smiled down at her. What now? Now, Harriet said, drawing strength from his presence beside her, we wait to see if he's as smart as he thinks he is. The next 24 hours were tense. They stayed at Harriet's homestead, weapons ready, half expecting Chambers to send men despite the threat of exposure. But the night passed without incident, and by morning, they were ready to return to town for Chambers' answer. This time, when they entered the bank, they were immediately shown to his office. Chambers sat behind his desk looking haggard as if he hadn't slept. A well-dressed man Harriet didn't recognize stood beside him. This is Mr. Leland, Chambers said tersely, an attorney from El Paso. He has prepared the documents you requested. The lawyer nodded courteously. Miss Ross, Mr. Quinn. I've drafted an agreement recognizing Miss Ross's full ownership of her property and all associated water rights. Additionally, Mr. Chambers has agreed to establish a fund to compensate certain individuals for irregularities in previous property transactions. Quinn stepped forward to examine the documents. And the mining company, They've agreed to negotiate directly with Miss Ross regarding water usage rights, Mr. Leland confirmed. Mr. Chambers will have no part in those transactions. The agreement was comprehensive, covering everything they demanded and more. After reading it thoroughly, Harriet signed, watching as Chambers did the same, his signature sharp and angry on the page. "Is that satisfactory, Miss Ross?" Chambers asked, his voice cold. "It is," Harriet replied evenly, "provided you honor your commitments." "Oh, I will." Chambers' smile was tight. "Self-preservation is a powerful motivator, but remember, Miss Ross, you've made an enemy today." "No, Mr. Chambers," Quinn said quietly. "She's exposed one. There's a difference." As they left the bank, Harriet felt a weight lift from her shoulders. For the first time since her father's death, she felt truly secure in her ownership of the land they'd worked so hard to develop. "It's over," she said, almost disbelieving. "We actually won." Quinn smiled, though his eyes remained vigilant as they walked through town. "Chambers won't forget this. Or forgive it. We'll need to be careful for a while." Harriet questioned, stopping to look up at him. "Does that mean you're staying?" His expression softened as he gazed down at her. "If you'll have me." Instead of answering with words, Harriet rose on her tiptoes and kissed him, not caring who in Dalhart might see. Quinn's arms encircled her waist, drawing her close as he returned the kiss with equal fervor. When they finally parted, breathless and smiling, Quinn brushed a strand of hair from her face. "I promised one night of protection," he said softly, "but that kiss makes me want to stay forever." "Good," Harriet whispered against his lips, "because that's exactly how long I want you to stay." In the weeks that followed, life changed dramatically for Harriet and Wade. The mining company, eager to secure water rights for their operation, offered a generous contract that would provide Harriet with a steady income for years to come. With those funds, they were able to complete the well her father had started, proving definitively that his vision had been correct all along. Chambers kept his word, likely more out of fear of exposure than any sense of honor. The families he'd wronged received compensation, and while he remained a powerful figure in Dalhart, his influence was diminished. He avoided Harriet and Wade whenever their paths crossed in town, his resentment obvious but impotent. As for Wade Quinn, the wanted posters from Colorado mysteriously disappeared after he made a quiet trip to speak with the territorial marshal. Harriet never asked what was said during that meeting, but when he returned, there was a lightness to him she hadn't seen before, as if a burden had been lifted from his shoulders. With his past no longer pursuing him, Wade turned his attention to learning about farming and ranching. He proved to be a quick study, and his natural skills with horses and building soon made valuable contributions to the homestead. Together, they expanded the operation, purchasing additional cattle and hiring 2 young men from town to help with the increasing workload. Summer turned to fall, and as the first cool evenings arrived, Wade and Harriet sat on their porch, watching the sunset paint the Texas sky in brilliant oranges and purples. His arm rested comfortably around her shoulders, her head leaning against him in a posture that had become wonderfully familiar. "I never thought I'd have this," Wade said quietly, his eyes on the horizon. "A home, peace, someone to share it with." Harriet placed her hand over his. "Are you happy here, truly, after all your years of wandering?" He turned to look at her, his blue eyes warm with an emotion that still made her heart race. "Happier than I ever believed possible." He paused, seeming to gather his thoughts. "I've been thinking, Harriet." "A dangerous pastime," she teased gently. He smiled, but there was a seriousness beneath it. "I've been thinking about us, about the future." His hand found hers, fingers intertwining. "I never expected to want roots, a permanent place, but now I can't imagine being anywhere else." or with anyone else. Harriet's breath caught as Wade shifted, reaching into his pocket to withdraw a small wooden box. "I'm not a wealthy man," he said, opening the box to reveal a simple gold band set with a small pearl. "And I'm still learning how to be a farmer instead of a hired gun. But I know that I love you, Harriet Ross. And if you'll have me, I'd like to spend the rest of my life right here, building something with you." Tears blurred Harriet's vision as she looked from the ring to Wade's face. "Are you asking me to marry you, Wade Quinn?" "I believe I am," he said, his voice rough with emotion. "If you're amenable." The echo of their conversation months ago brought a smile to Harriet's lips. "I am very amenable, Mr. Quinn." The kiss they shared then was a promise of love, of partnership, of a future neither had dared hope for before finding each other. They were married in November, in a small ceremony attended by the handful of friends they'd made in Dalhart. The town's attitude toward Harriet had gradually shifted as rumors of Chambers' misdeeds circulated, and as Wade became a respected member of the community through his fair dealings and willingness to help neighbors in need. By the following spring, their homestead had transformed. The house had been expanded, the barn rebuilt, and the fields were lush with early crops. The well, now completed, provided abundant water not only for their land but, through carefully negotiated agreements, for neighboring farms as well. One warm evening, as they sat on their porch watching the sunset, a daily ritual, they both cherished, Harriet took Wade's hand and placed it gently on her stomach. "I have news," she said, smiling at his confused expression. "In about 7 months, our family will be growing." Wade's eyes widened, then filled with a joy so pure it took Harriet's breath away. "A baby? You're sure?" she nodded, laughing as he gathered her carefully into his arms as if she'd suddenly become fragile. "I'm pregnant, Wade, not made of glass," she teased, though she melted into his embrace. "A family," he whispered against her hair, his voice thick with emotion. "Our family." Their son, Samuel, was born on a crisp December morning with his father's blue eyes and his mother's determined spirit. As Wade held his son for the first time, looking down at the tiny face with an expression of wonder and fierce love, Harriet knew that the journey that had brought them together, as unlikely and dangerous as it had been, had led exactly where they were meant to be. Over the years, their family and their homestead continued to flourish. 2 years after Samuel, their daughter Emily joined the family, followed 3 years later by another son, James. Wade proved to be a devoted father, teaching their children to ride, to respect the land, and most importantly, to stand up for what was right, even when it was difficult. Edwin Chambers eventually left Dalhart, his power diminished though never entirely broken. The town thrived without his oppressive influence, with new businesses opening and a sense of community strengthening among the residents. As for the red ledger that had changed everything, Harriet and Wade never spoke of it publicly. The evidence remained hidden away, a safeguard they hoped never to need again, but maintained nonetheless. Some threats were best countered with vigilance rather than confrontation. On the 10th anniversary of their first meeting, Wade surprised Harriet with a small gift, a silver locket containing miniature portraits of their children. "To remember what matters most," he said, as he fastened it around her neck. Later that evening, after the children were asleep, they sat on their porch as they had countless times before, watching as stars appeared in the darkening sky. Wade's arm was around her shoulders, her head resting comfortably against him, a posture as familiar and essential as breathing. "Do you ever think about how differently things might have turned out?" Harriet asked softly. "If you hadn't warned me about the Blackwoods, if you hadn't come back." Wade was quiet for a moment, his fingers absently stroking her arm. "Sometimes. But then I look at what we've built together, this home, our children, The life we share, and I can't imagine any other path." Harriet smiled, turning to press a kiss to his jaw, now bearing a few strands of silver among the dark. "The night you promised to protect me, I never dreamed it would lead to this." "Neither did I," he chuckled softly. "I only promised one night, remember? And yet here you are, 10 years later." Wade tilted her chin up, his blue eyes still as piercing, still as capable of making her heart race meeting hers. "Best decision I ever made, breaking that promise." "Oh," Harriet raised an eyebrow, "and what made you stay when you were so determined to leave?" His smile was soft, full of a love that had only deepened with time. "You know the answer to that, Harriet Quinn." He lowered his head, his lips brushing hers gently. "It was your kiss that made me stay forever." As the stars continued to appear above them, Wade and Harriet remained on their porch, surrounded by the home they'd built, the life they'd created together, all because a cowboy had promised one night of protection, but found something worth staying for, something worth fighting for, something worth loving forever.